Okay, welcome to Coru, the podcast. Slightly different format this week, Kaylee. Nice to see you again. It's been a wee while now, hasn't it?
Yeah. Good to see you too. I think we've both been fairly busy, and there's been a lot going on in the world.
There has indeed, yes. But let's try and keep it positive, eh? Yeah. The new format for Coru, the podcast, is the research roundup. And the idea of this is that we pick up one or two bits of relevant research that are fresh to the scene, and we talk about what it means, the merits of what's said, and maybe start to try and pick some of those things apart and decide where it sits within education. Everything clearly is still focused on education, and Kaylee's picked out a great article, report article, as it undersells it, all 247 pages of it. I will share my screen, and maybe Kaylee, you could give us a little bit of a summary as to what it is.
Absolutely. So this is the OECD Digital Education Outlook for 2026, which has recently come out. And I have to admit, it is a hefty read. It is big. I think Chris said 260 odd pages of it, but a lot of it really, really valuable. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I think it's important because we did our last podcast on critical theory. I think it is important to note who is creating and funding this, because that is where the power lie. And so this, I feel like I learned something last time.
Follow them. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is based in kind of economy and democracy. That is what the OECD kind of stands for. And it is based on 38 countries all around the world, quite a few of them European, most of them quite highly developed, and interesting. So this document looks through digital education as we're experiencing it, and most of the document is towards Gen AI, generative AI, and its function in education for teachers, for students, and for like learning and pedagogy as a broader kind of subject.
It's probably worth distinguishing and just clarifying what we mean by Gen AI for those that are maybe new to the whole AI genre, the whole brave new world that we'll talk about shortly. And that idea is that AI has been around for ages, essentially, in the form of machine learning and things like that. But Gen AI is the relatively new area where it creates new content. It writes your essays for you, that sort of thing, or does it? We'll talk about that as we get into the discussion. But that's really what Gen AI is. So the things like Chat, Gemini, and all of those others that are out there that can create, pictures of your dog dancing on a skateboard, that kind of thing. Those are the things that we're talking about when we're talking about Gen AI. So I'm going to throw a question over to you, Kaylee, a really simple one, and it's one that I've discussed at various conferences, most recently the Fabisia Teaching and Community Conference, Teacher Community Conference in Hanoi. Is AI cheating for students and teachers?
I love the fact that you just dive straight in there, straight with what we're thinking. And I love the fact that this document actually talks about that quite a lot. So it depends on how you're using it, I think is the broad answer. So it's on the difference between like the paradoxical difference between performance versus learning, right? Yeah. If students are using AI to output a task with no learning value, with no metacognition, with no thinking, right? Then we're talking about cheating. If we're finding that task performance is going up and up and up, but learning, deep thinking, that process is going down, then we're cheating.
Okay.
But it is our job as teachers to make sure that the tasks that we are giving don't allow for that. That's what.
Okay. Two questions that come out of that. First of all, I love that idea of thinking hard. That runs parallel with what one of the sort of great researchers and so forth of our day, a chap called Rob Coe, who I was talking about yesterday on education leaders, the pillars of education. Does some great work with evidence-based education up here in the northeast of England. That thinking hard, and that ultimately is what learning is. And a lot of his work was built around the idea of poor proxies for learning. We often talk about learning and performance, and I think that often people mistake the idea of knowledge retention as learning, because it's been so fundamental to what we have to do. Once we've got that knowledge, we can then build upon that and work with it. I wonder how important knowledge retention is now, and whether as teachers we actually need to be subject experts anymore in the sort of age of AI, or whether we just need to have good judgment that we can walk through experiences and development with students. And I'm thinking particularly about how students of today are going to be using AI in their jobs of the future. Knowledge is going to be far less important than skills, arguably.
For sure. And that's why we have to think about like the process, because to be able to gain knowledge quickly, we have the tools to be able to do that. And so it is the process of the thinking, the getting to the answer, the creating of the new that needs to be happening. And I think we saw this with like curriculum development from, I don't know, the first round of the national curriculum in the UK through to what was redesigned. There was a shift from knowledge to skills, right? And now I think we need to shift a little bit further potentially towards the understanding of the process rather than the outcome. Because you can put into, I don't know, Claude or ChatGPT or any of these, the mathematical equation and get the answer, but the value is in the doing.
So the next question, I guess, is who are the decision makers and how old are they within education generally? And I'm looking at my picture on there with sort of silvered hair and things like that. And yeah, it's a lot of people for whom the concept of AI is juxtaposed to their understanding of what education actually is. And I guess that goes to the heart of that idea of poor proxies for learning as well. We kind of look at some fairly simplistic metrics around learning rather than actually necessarily delving into the more complex stuff of what kids are thinking about and how they're thinking about stuff. I looked at this report, and yeah, it's hard to pick fault with it particularly. I think there are absolutely massive risks with AI, and I think there is that risk of cognitive offloading and all of those kind of things. And that I think you call it the performance learning paradox, where you use AI as a crutch, and that sort of metacognitive laziness, where you rely on that for answers rather than actually going through the process. But even as I read that report, I thought, this is written with a perspective that's in the past and not the future. That whole metacognitive laziness, where you rely on Gen AI for answers, and that cognitive offloading, and they bypass what we see as that mental struggle. It's just because that's where our mental struggle has traditionally been. And maybe the mental struggle just needs to be reframed and doing something slightly differently. And I think that's something that sort of came up it's a book by Salman Khan, the Khan Academy chap, called Brave New World, and intentionally entitled as well, to sort of juxtapose it with Aldous Huxley's work, I guess. And we look at the benefits that can be gained, the time saving, the stress, that cognitive load, and that sort of shift in role, as it were. The magic moments you have as a teacher are when you're sat down chatting to your children in class. Yeah.
And I think for me, I thought this was quite, I don't know whether I'm a bit more traditionalist than you, potentially it's true. I thought that the document did quite a good job of explaining the conditional nature of the technology. It is not, it shouldn't be a banning. Do we use it or not? Do we offer it to students or not? Should they have it or not? Cheating or not? But the how. It is a tool. It is an axe, right? It is an axe or a car, slightly more complicated than that. But when we first invented the car, did we then start to drive everywhere? Well, some communities more than others. Did that change then how the communities were formed? Some communities more than others. Do we also, now 100 years on, notice the benefit of walking places and what that does to us physiologically? Do you know what I mean? I feel like it did a really good job of explaining the tool that a generative AI is and how we can really benefit, and where we need to view this partnership, because it is a partnership, as something that needs to be developed and changed between the teachers, the learners, the systems, and the generative AI, rather than a yes or no, in or out, hot or cold situation.
Yeah, I wonder if we're just coming at this from the wrong angle. I wonder if we're kind of coming at it from a grown-up's angle and not really, we're looking at with all our sort of historical baggage, and me being I've got a few years on you, I've got a bit more historical baggage than you. Coru recently offered a course whereby the first phase of it's about AI for schools. And the first phase of it is actually doing some work with students and trying to establish how they're actually using AI, trying to give them some guardrails and how to use it appropriately and so on, but actually digging into how they're using it and what's important for them before we then transpose that into the work with teachers. And I think that we perhaps are missing that scope and development, because it's youngsters of today that are going to be bringing that into their workplace, into their day-to-day lives, and we're still operating with a sort of 1990s mindset. Well, I'm stuck. If you look at my Spotify playlist, apart from education leaders, I'm definitely stuck in the late 80s, early 90s. I think there's a beautiful South on there at the moment.
Beautiful, and I love that. And I think there is, there is a section in the document that talks about, the fact that we've almost got like a bottleneck in our pedagogy, because technology is just advancing faster than our ability right now to use it well educationally. And I think that kind of touches on your point, Chris. Like the kids that are experiencing this are kind of integrating it into their daily life and world much quicker than necessarily in the classroom. And that's, comes down to the other things that we've spoken about, ad nauseum, about time and resources, and teachers just having too much to do and not enough time to do it. But a lot of the beginning of this document talks about how generative AI can do a lot of good things really well. Like a lot of the positives where we talk about scaling personal support, enhancing the quality of feedback, and to some extent assessment. Talks about assessment in there.
Yeah.
These tools, Claude and ChatGPT, are very good at, if we can take the time to merge them with good, strong pedagogy. I'm trying to think of a good question to like throw back at you for that. I haven't got anything. My brain.
There was a really interesting report by the Hive Group, I think, in 2025, and they talked about how I think it was about half of all teachers felt that using AI to prepare their work was cheating. And I think that illustrates that sort of that mindset, that we still have this idea of cheating. And that book, Brave New Worlds, talks about the evolution of cheating and how we need to change our mindset around that and actually start to understand that it's not cheating. And if you go back 30 years, maybe 40, using a spell check would have been cheating.
Yeah.
Now it's expected practice. Why didn't you use your spell check? Sort of idea. And I think that it kind of digs into that age perception and that age gap that exists, that we maybe need to get across, and accept that it's the youngsters that are setting the agenda for this, and we need to adapt to that as a profession.
I love that. So yeah, you've got this kind of idea of this over reliance on AI reducing, cognitive development, and therefore making, in the long term, learning easier but minds weaker. And I think, as far as I've read, so we in the last month and a half, Denmark have come out and said, no technology in schools. Not quite that, but definitely no phones in schools until 13. I want to say, absolutely. And they are scaling back massively on the technology used in those kind of formative educational years. And the arguments behind that is because they were seeing the weaker attention, weaker engagement in activities. What would you say to Denmark?
To Denmark, well, I'll tell you what I would say to Denmark. I'm thinking about putting a poll out when we publish this podcast on LinkedIn. I'm going to put a little bit of a poll out and see what everyone else would say to Denmark before I commit my opinion. Yeah, there we go. I think probably one of the big issues that did flag up in this report, which I thought was entirely valid and possibly something that as a wider society we need to address, is that idea of a sort of digital divide. That we've seen it with access to the internet, we've seen it with access to computers, and even within the UK, a relatively wealthy country, you can see it from one school to the next, where some kids have got all the latest tech and access to all of the latest sort of things, and others are still doing sort of chalk and talk. So I think that we need to address that. And I don't just mean within a domestic setting, I mean in a wider setting, that accessibility to the internet, that accessibility to the wider picture of AI. And if we're ever going to pull those countries out of poverty that are languishing in those areas, that maybe we need to do something about that. There's a very unpleasant idea that we're quite reluctant to provide poorer countries with resources because it costs us money as Western countries, despite the fact that we're particularly rich. And we're quite happy to see poverty persist in some parts of the world when we should be putting it right with things like this. So I think there's a bigger philosophical question for the United Nations, the OECD, etc., to address with that. And I think that's probably the bigger picture for me. I think children are going to do what they do with AI, and I think that our influence on that is going to be muted or limited at best. And I think we need to get on board with what children need rather than anything else.
There was a little note in the very first chapter about the use of AI in various different areas, and about how even if the internet and the technology was not the world's leading, that actually generative AI has been able to go in, and because it does, if you have the right prompt, if you know how to structure those really well so that you try and get rid of as many hallucinations as possible and really kind of use it, that a lot of students were benefiting. I'm just trying to find that.
Have you had an argument with AI yet?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, me too.
And I've also been less successful than most, I would say, in terms of like image generation or more creative generation from specifically ChatGPT, because that is my go-to. Although I know that I need to branch out. Like, I'm stuck a little bit, which is nice, because actually one of the other sections of this report does go through some more like educational pedagogical systems.
Mm.
Yeah, so Gen AI tutors or AI teaching assistants,
Mm.
which I think is an area that I would love to explore a little bit more.
Okay. If you had to choose one item, one platform to recommend to schools, what would it be? I know what I would recommend.
You go first.
Notebook LM.
Notebook LM.
Part of the sort of Google suite. You control your sources, you can set stuff up, you can kind of manage it, and it's a kind of halfway house between the Wild West of normal Gen AI, and it allows you to you can actually set it up and prompt it in such a way that your students get given like Socratic questioning. So they put a prompt in, and then they get asked further questions. So it mitigates that cognitive offload idea, and it starts to get them going through that process.
That's really interesting, because yeah, the Socratic questioning came up quite a bit in this report, depending on how you set it up. And I think there was there one that was mentioned, a Socratic playground as a as a tool, educational tool, generative AI educational tool.
In all seriousness, on that note, in terms of schools actually using Gen AI and recommending their students use it, I think there's probably some questions to be asked around the sort of responses and the safety that it gives, and whether stuff gets flagged up to teachers, etc. And there are even some of the mainstream platforms, I'm not going to mention names, but go and have a look if you're using any of the mainstream platforms, as to whether if a kid puts in something about suicide or self-harm, for instance, does something flag up to the teacher. You're able to control things a little better on Notebook LM than you are in most places, but just check what you're using and whether that actually generates those sort of safeguarding flags that you might want to see.
For sure. And I feel like for parents at home as well, because high level news articles have come out recently, and there are cases being brought to court for a bunch of different but dangerous behaviors that aren't being
responsible for that. It's an interesting one, isn't it? You know, my first degree was law, and you kind of think, well, where does the culpability lie if the AI has counseled you towards something stupid?
This is a really interesting conversation, and one that I was having with my husband and my brother-in-law yesterday evening over dinner, because I'd said we were going to do this podcast today. And being married to a lawyer, and having Pete, who's just finishing his MBA, absolutely fascinating between education, law, and business as to where do things lie? Where does the responsibility lie? And I suppose, as to do the TDLR, it is with everyone. No, it is parents, it is teachers, it is the companies. It's you can't point the finger at one. Everybody has to work together. And I suppose that's what one of the other themes of this document is, that it is a tool, and therefore it needs to be used as such, and it needs to be a partnership between generative AI, teachers, and students, in order to get the great educational outcomes that we think are possible.
For me, the one thing I would say is that probably the biggest bit is to just listen to the students, listen to the youngsters, and see how they're using it, and try and adapt to that, rather than come in with your own agenda from the 1990s. The music in the 1990s was great, but the perspective on tech possibly not where it needed to be. Let's see. You're rolling your eyes when I said that about the music, Kaylee. What's that about?
I'm not rolling my eyes about your music choice, because who doesn't love Beautiful South? From my understanding of how our brain develops, looking at risk and predicting future possibilities is something that the teenage brain, whilst it is like effectively metamorphosizing, melting and reforming, is just not something that especially teens are very good at. And so I do think we need to listen, and we need to talk, and we need to keep this an open communication. And we need to also, we know that more teenagers have car accidents because their perception of risk and prediction is not as strong. That doesn't develop until around about 25. I think they're now saying it's going up and up and up and up and up. And so we do also need to protect and develop together. That would be my other thing. I love the beautiful South, love the 90s. Want to keep us all safe and learning in this best way that we can.
Yeah, well, on that note, I think we've reached our time limit, I'm afraid.
We have.
AI, force for good, force for evil. Be interested to hear your comments, and have a look at the poll that we're going to put out on LinkedIn. Be interested to see what that brings back. Ceilidh Leisure, always a pleasure to see you. Great to catch up, and yeah, thank you for that report. It was fascinating.
No worries. No, this was lovely. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cora, and catch you all soon.
See you next month.
Yeah.
Bye.